Hello and welcome to episode 128 of the world's first Paul Weller fan podcast. I'm Dan Jennings, and 10 years ago I gave up my live streaming career as a radio presenter with one big regret: never getting to interview my hero, the legendary British musician Paul Weller. This podcast exists purely to solve that issue. Welcome to Desperately Seeking Paul. On this episode of the podcast, we hear from a musician with a fascinating story, Terry Edwards, a man who played trumpet, sax, guitar, keys with some incredible artists, including Nick Cave, Gallon Drunk, the Jesus and Mary Chain, PJ Harvey, and Tom Waits. He was a founding member of the Higsons and has performed and released records as a solo artist with and without his band, the Scapegoats. I'd encourage you to check out his covers EPs, imaginative versions of music by the likes of The Fall, Miles Davis, The Damned, The Sex Pistols, The Clash, and the brilliant album My Wife Doesn't Understand Me, a trailblazing genre-busting classic which paved the way for the British punk jazz movement that followed in its wake in the 90s. And when we talk about Mr. Weller, you will find Terry playing on the album Wake Up the Nation. Another really interesting guest. Let's get into it. Terry Edwards, thanks for joining me.
My pleasure.
Hey, look, lovely to have you on. But look, I don't know where to start. I mean, we're talking trumpet, flugelhorn, sax, guitar, keys. You're a writer, arranger, performer, even a vocalist. I mean, there's no end to your talents, my friend.
You missed my midlife crisis instrument, which is the flute, which I took up when I turned 50.
I always try to avoid talking about the flute.
People do, yeah.
Well, I love that. At 50 years old, you're like, I've got to learn something new.
Yes.
This love of music, where does it come from? Is it something that was instilled in you as a youngster with your parents, or is it something that you discovered at school? Where did you get this bug from?
A little bit of all those things, really. I wasn't really pushed into it, but I did. My mother's side of the family is quite musical, so there was a piano in the house. Her sister was a piano teacher. She taught me piano. Her parents played music. So it was kind of around, but it was never thrust down our throats to do. In fact, what happened was, of course, I'm the generation that wanted to be Geoff Hurst and score a hat-trick for England at Wembley.
Yeah.
And I broke my leg when I was 5. So clearly I couldn't run after a ball at that time. And so I just got interested in the piano because I was housebound, as it were, with a great big cast on my leg. And so it kind of started there, although I did like the sound of music, never ever the musical. But I was just interested in the...
Not even at Christmas, come on.
No, really, not ever. Apparently I could sing in tune from a very early age, at one or two. I could repeat tunes and stuff, probably better than I can now.
Yeah, what happened?
Yeah, back to the days of when there were only 3 channels on the TV and things on. I used to love hearing the acoustic guitar, even in the hands of Val Doonican. Just something coming through the telly or whatever at a very early age. I just was interested in the noise. So I guess that's all part of it. I was encouraged to play, once I'd shown an interest in it. The multi-instrumentalism, I kind of like to think it's something to do with my dad always holding down loads of jobs at the same time. So that's what I do. I hold down loads of jobs at the same time.
Well, I guess the more you can play, the more value you are to artists if you're a session musician or making your own stuff as well, right?
You can get ideas down quite quickly as well, because, if you want to hear a horn section sound, I can multi-track it up reasonably quickly so that you get the idea of what it will sound like. But as my mate Pete Saunders, who was the keyboards player in Dexys originally, he always says when we're working together, thing is, Terry, you're very good value for money. And I think that probably helps, if you're going on the road and you can do a couple of instruments and it's only one hotel room, I guess I'm good value for money.
Now, your start out in bands and performing like live would have been around the time of the Jam and Weller and punk and all that as a founding member of the Higsons. So this was a punk funk band signed to Jerry Demmer's label, Two Tone, eventually. And obviously people will have heard of Charlie Higson, which I guess is where the name comes from. It'd be a bit odd if it hadn't, but go for the fast show and all that kind of thing. And I was trying to think this morning, there was another member of our podcast who was in the Higsons. I'm trying to remember who it was. Was it a member of Jules's band? But I have to check the list while we're talking. But where did that come from? How did you get involved in that? And were you a Jam fan? Were you a punk fan? Was that your world?
Before I answer your second question, I think the first one is Phil Veacock, the sax player. Phil played on a couple of Higsons. He wasn't a member of the band, but he had a band called the Larks, and they supported the Higsons.
That's right. It was Phil. Bless him. Hello, Phil. Thank you. Yes, you're right. Absolutely. Yes. Second question then. Yeah.
Second question. I kind of side a little bit with Robert Elms here in that I'm more of a Star Council fan than a Jam fan. It's not a war or anything. It's not like driving a line down.
You don't have to pick sides. You're right.
But yeah, that sort of thing. But that kind of appealed to me a bit more.
I guess is that the horn sections and that kind of sound being up your street a bit more then.
And also I think from early days of punk, I know that it's chronologically it's correct to think of the Jam as being, In the City came out in 1977. And I know it's not a million miles, it's the guitar, bass, drums and in the right corner. But it wasn't really punk to me. So the Damned were punk, fast, furious and doing something. The Jam were still had a foot in the old school ways of, you could hear the 60s influences more in the Jam than you could in the tear up the rule books punk rock thing. So
and I guess that soul and the R&B influences and the Motown floods through, doesn't it?
I know that sort of, it's different because we have the benefit of hindsight now, but I think in the thrust of the time, there was definitely a slight difference between the new mod and the sort of new punk things.
And where did you sit? What was your influence, your love of music, your image, and your where did you consider yourself in one of those kind of camps?
Well, of course, being the generation that I'm, punk didn't really, there wasn't a year zero. There is obviously for writers, they think it's a great thing to have a year zero. People were listening to other stuff. People who formed the Sex Pistols and the Damned and the Clash and everything. Of course, they were listening to music before punk because punk hadn't happened. Yeah. So I'm of that generation as well. So, of course, I was learning guitar, playing Beatles songs. Trumpet and piano were more classical. I read the music and did the exams, whereas piano and saxophone, I could already read the music, but I didn't do the exams. So they sort of fell into a different part for me, different place for me. I know people always say, I listen to loads of different music. And yes, we all do. There are certain bits that we like more than others, though, I think. Otherwise, everything would be beige, wouldn't it?
There are many artists that I want to dig into you working with. The CV is pretty impressive, to say the least. As it's the Paul Weller Fan podcast, we should focus on the Weller bit first. And I'm guessing this is your first connection with Paul, which is this beauty here, Wake Up the Nation 2010. Had you had any connection, any dealings with Mr. Weller before being on that album?
We'd met briefly in a bar somewhere in the West End, and I was with a couple of Higsons and he was with Mick Talbot. It wasn't at a gig or anything. I think we just happened to be in a bar, and it was shortly after or around the time of Live Aid. And actually, I don't think Live Aid had happened. I think the record had happened. Feed the World had happened. And there was mooted by one or two of the serious drinking or Higsons people were saying, well, it'd be good to do an indie one of these, And we chatted a little bit about that. Things get mentioned over a couple of drinks. And one of them was, why not do a Band-Aid kind of single, but with indie people doing it. And he said, if you want some guitaring, I'm up for it. And of course, nothing ever happened.
Oh, no.
So we had met, but it was, it was just a social occasion and we didn't really talk about music that much apart from these sort of a 5-minute encounter. But you're right that, that was the first thing I'd done with him. And it was actually via that album was largely, if not entirely, co-written with Simon Dine. Simon works at Go Discs. He was a neighbour of mine. He lived down the road from me and he shared a house with someone else that I knew. So I'd known him for quite a while, separate from, earlier than this. And as happens when you've been doing this for a little bit of time, people go, oh, we need a saxophone on this. I know Terry, he can do it. So that's really what happened. So I played baritone on one track and I think flugelhorn on another on Wake Up the Nation.
It was interesting how Simon was working with Paul and funny enough, in the latest Record Collector I was reading this morning, he's mentioned and this album and the fact that he'd kind of give Paul these little snippets of sound and these little sound collages. And suddenly Paul was writing music in a very different way to how he was writing music in the Jam and the Style Council, where he'd flesh everything out at home on an acoustic guitar or piano, write the lyrics in full. And he'd take something into the studio that's pretty fully fleshed out, really. And, it's ready to go and almost ready to be recorded. Whereas by the time we're into 22 Dreams and Wake Up the Nation, which Simon was working with him on, it sounds like it was much more kind of taking in some rough ideas or some rough sketches into the studio, but a lot of it winging it. I mean, on this album, he was talking about kind of making up the lyrics as he went along, like in a live studio environment.
Yeah, I can imagine. Obviously, by the time I came in to do my bits, I was replacing samples somewhere. So the songs were written and ready and everything. But Simon's way of working was sampling things, taking sounds and putting things together. And he's not a songwriter in that sense. I think he does play the guitar, but he's not, as we were talking earlier about the old school way of writing songs, the Small Faces way, the Who way of doing it. You were the bloke, usually a bloke, who had the guitar and strummed the chords, and that was how you did. And Paul's very much of that. That's the way he works. That's the way he's always written songs. But Simon has never written them like that. He's always taken bits and pieces and sort of been a bit of a magpie in a certain way, but also just hearing things that other people don't hear when he puts stuff together. I mean, what he'd done previously was Noonday Underground. I don't know if you've heard
Yes. Yeah. Great. Loved it.
Really good stuff, But of course, the things he was using, some of the drum samples and stuff, they're very much that 60s feel. He likes that sound. And with Jim Beattie, who he was working with from Spiritualized, who were an offshoot of Primal Scream, that was very much what they were into. It was a new way of writing things. All I'm doing is agreeing with you here.
Well, those are my favourite guests on the podcast. The funny thing is, as a listener to Paul, and as a listener, it's not just Paul, any album, you pick up the album and you look at the credits and you look at who's performing on those songs, as much as you're reading the lyrics and you're listening to the sounds and stuff. And in your head, it's inevitable that you look at the lineup and you go, God, look at them all amazing in the studio together. You forget that these, everything's layered up and it's Pro Tools and people are kind of adding bits at different stages through this recording process. Because in your head, it's kind of like, man, this is like a mega super group. So when you talk about like Wake Up the Nation, we've got Bev Bevan on drums, for goodness sake. We've got, Stevie Craddock on percussion. We've got obviously Paul, and we've got you on sax on that one. An
interesting story there, because Bev Bevan's on drums on the track that I played on. I've never met him, but there's Clem Catini is another drummer who's on the record. You're acquainted with Clem, are you?
I'm aware of Clem, but he's not been on the podcast. So.
Basically, the British Hal Blaine, really. He played on so many things. And I met him at the Dublin Castle when he was doing a rock and roll book club thing, because a biography of him had come out, I think, co-written with him and two other writers. And there they were. And he played on Shaking All Over, Johnny Kidd and the Pirates, which was number one the day I was born.
Oh, nice.
So I introduced myself, or was introduced to him. We had a chat with him. He's a really lovely guy. And I told him that and said, and 50 years later, we played on the same album, not on the same track, but we're on the same album, which is I just love that, just astonishing. And bless him, a couple of months later, he came to see the Near Jazz Experience play with, so he's been to see me play now. As well.
That's
it's such a sweet thing, the way that all these things sort of tie together.
That's amazing. I mean, his career is incredible, Clem, wasn't it? I mean, gosh, I have reached out, but I haven't managed to track it down. But yeah, incredible. But yeah, in your head, you're thinking this is a super group and you're all in the studio together. But clearly that didn't happen, right?
No, it doesn't. No.
And the same so the other track that you're on is Grasp and Still Connect. I mean, I really love this album. It doesn't get talked about by many as a kind of favorite, but it's really interesting because let me ask you about that track, first of all. So Grasp and Still Connect is, Steve Pilgrim on drums. It's the Weller band that we know and love of recent years. Andy Crofts on guitar as well. And you on, it says horns. So is it a variety of different horns? Can you remember?
I think it was just the flugelhorn.
Okay.
Yeah. And one or two of those people were in the control room when I did it, but the track was finished. I was just replacing a sample or just doing literally what the tune that was in there. Were
both of these sessions in one day? Were you down at Black Barn Studios in Ripley?
Indeed, yeah. Yeah, which I've been to a couple of times since, because I play with Rhoda Dakar in her band. She and Paul have a very good relationship. He lets her use the studio when he's not in there, so we have to dash in and do stuff very quickly. And so I've been there, been in the studio a couple of times. It's really enjoyable. It's a great place to be, and of course, largely analog gear. And you look around and there's more than one Hammond organ in the room, that sort of thing. It's a good place to work. Good sound you get there, and he's been very generous with studio time for us to record a couple of EPs. The Low Tech 4, Rhoda Dakar on the Low Tech 4.
Rhoda's been on the podcast and she was fabulous, an absolutely brilliant guest. I loved her.
You don't get any radio silence with Rhoda, do you?
I think I only asked 3 questions. You're right. It's a bit like Billy Bragg. It was great. And what's Paul like in the studio environment? Was it like, I mean, you were literally replacing the sounds that were already there. So I'm guessing he's not giving in to give too much direction, but pretty relaxed.
Very relaxed. And in fact, for Wake Up the Nation, he wasn't there. He came in a little bit later. I don't know if I was early or I just went in and did my job and everyone was happy.
That was a number 2 album, I think I'm right in saying. And
yes, damn it.
Sorry about that. I mean, you have had a number 1 though, right?
Just, yes. Yeah.
But back in the day, here it is, recording produced by Simon Dye and Paul Weller, Wake Up the Nation. So this was 2010. And you thought Paul was happy. You know, he was Mercury nominated, didn't win. I remember him being interviewed and being pretty pissed off about the fact that he didn't win because he thought he should have done, and being really happy about that album at the time. And live, they were incredible. I remember watching 5 nights at the Royal Albert Hall. I went along for those gigs. Bruce Foxton played with him. Kelly Jones for the Stereophonics. Amazing. He was like really, it felt like he was really behind that album, really happy with that album. And then 2020, we get this. I don't know if you even know about this. The album's remixed and it's re-released and it's a new version because he says he wasn't quite happy first time around. Are you aware of that? Did you know it was coming back out?
Well, funnily enough, I went to one of the shows that Madness did at the Roundhouse. They did 3 nights in a row, and this was December 2019, I guess it has to be. Yeah. So, but Paul was in the bar very briefly backstage at the end of the show, and so I reintroduced myself to him because we had only fleetingly met a couple of times, and said, "Oh, Terry, I was on Wake Up the Nation," and he told me it was being reissued, a 10th anniversary issue of it. So I knew that it was going to come out, but that was about it. I don't have the new version, and am I still on it?
Well, I thought so. I've not checked. That would be quite funny.
There were 2 things we took off because we really didn't like them. Yeah.
If you're not, then I'll there'll be radio silence here. No, you're still on. You're still on. Wake up. Oh dear, that's funny. I hadn't thought about that. That would have been really awkward. You're still on both tracks, Terry. Thank goodness.
Very good.
Yeah, interesting, because Paul's famously not somebody who revisits old stuff very often. And the fact, I don't think ever in his career have we had a remix, a reversioning of an album. I know he's not replayed anything on it, but it's interesting that he's kind of gone back and you know, obviously a COVID project of kind of thinking, well, no, but it was done pre-COVID, right? It was released during COVID, but yeah. Well,
certainly the idea was there, whether it had been done when we had the conversation, but he said it was planned. But I guess they must have been quite far down the road for it to come out for the end of the date. So I turned 50 a few months after the album was out, and so my copy of it is signed to me on my 50th from Paul.
Oh, nice.
Sorry, I don't have it to hand. I could have.
Well, it's all right. It's an audio podcast, so we'll be fine. Okay. We'll pretend you've held it up for me. It's lovely to have it on vinyl because I couldn't afford the original vinyl these days. So the re-releases are always quite nice. Now, talk to me about you as a solo artist and of your own thing. And then I want to quiz you about some of the other, you mentioned Madness. We're going to come back to that, but some of the other amazing artists that you've played with as well. But for you, for your own thing, what does that give you producing your own stuff that you don't get from working with others? I
think it's finding a home for the orphans. You know, that Tom Waits brought out those reissues of things that hadn't been on albums proper and were just odds and sods. And I find that I write things or get ideas for things that aren't, in a sense, complete in albums, and they're ideas that are maybe, I guess, being children of being someone who bought singles and EPs and things like that. Maybe I think of things in terms of smaller groupings rather than the full album. Hence the first solo things being those cover versions, which were Terry Edwards plays the music of Jim and William Reed, because I recorded 4 Mary Chain things. And funnily enough, that thing of not being in a band is interesting, because you're almost embarrassed to put your own name on things, because before you could be one of the Higsons, one of the gang, one of somebody else, you'd be in this group of things. Well, as soon as you put your own name on it, you really are just out there on your own. So I had to make jokey titles like plays the music of Terry Edwards salutes the magic of the fall, in an attempt to deflect the attention away from your own name.
Yeah. Well, even the fact that it's Terry Edwards and the Scapegoats, it's a bit Noel Gallagher as Flying Birds. You kind of go, why isn't he just Noel Gallagher?
There was a reason for that, really, is because I did release singles that I did everything on, and the Scapegoats was a band with 3 other guys in it who contributed to it. So it wouldn't be fair to say that it was me
right.
when the band needed an identity, as was pointed out to me by the bass player, Jem. So,
Fair enough.
But he was also quite sensible about that, because he said, if you just put your name up there, nobody knows if you've got a band or if you're there solo or whatever. So it makes sense to do that. It doesn't make sense in terms of Spotify and the internet these days, because every band that has a slightly different thing is a different entity according to the internet. Yeah. So if you look at Discogs and you see Terry Edwards, you don't find Terry Edwards and the Scapegoats in the same grouping. You know, it's very annoying.
Well, it's mad, isn't it? But also the other thing's true, whereby, I don't know if you know Billy Sullivan. So Billy Sullivan was an artist in the band called the Spitfires. He's now going solo. And the reason I mention it, there's two reasons I mention it. One, Simon Dine is the producer on it. So there's that lovely connection there as well. But if you go onto Amazon Music, for instance, and type in Billy Sullivan, you get all the other Billy Sullivans at the same time, of which there are lots, because it doesn't seem to want to split out artists. And I would imagine Terry Edwards is quite a common name as well, isn't it?
Oh, yes. It's been hilarious until just recently. I have managed to extricate myself from the very lovely Terry Edwards, the director of London Voices, and, you know, a chorister and beautiful bass voice. Sadly, we lost him earlier this year. I did manage to meet him once, and we were rather amused that, you know, people would phone me up or get in touch with me to see if I could arrange a choir, because I was the one who'd done The Mission, the soundtrack to The Mission, and had worked with Pavarotti. And I don't know if the boot was on the other foot quite so often, you know, if he got calls to, you know. So the Mary Chain, when you did stuff with Jesus and Mary Chain, I don't think I did that. Another Terry Edwards you occasionally find who played with Clifford T. Ward. He was a bass player. And there's a country and western singer from East Anglia, and we don't look alike at all. And you see a record of him with Terry Edwards, the 12th of Never, or whatever it is, and he's in a poncho, white beard, and all this stuff. And you just think, that's frightening. In fact, Simon Dine alerted me to this chat. That's quite funny. But I've managed on Spotify to split myself away from them finally. But it does take forever.
But there must also be some people who are in record shops are going, oh my God, I've not got this one from Terry Edwards. Let me get this. This is and I get home going, my goodness me, he's taking a different direction here. As you were saying that, I was obviously having to cross out things that are on my research here. For that, I shouldn't ask you about Pavarotti then. I've made a note of that, or The Mission. Okay. Well there's a fella linked to the Jam on this podcast multiple times. It's come up in this and seemed to go to every punk gig back in the day, every punk gig going. And I think even discovered the Jam and recommended them to Chris Parry, from what I remember, who signed them to Polydor, which is Shane McGowan. I have to ask you about Shane McGowan. Weren't you musical director for his 60th birthday?
I was indeed, yeah. No one was more surprised than me. The guy who programs the music at the National Concert Hall in Dublin, Gary Sheehan, he emailed me about this project. And I knew that he hadn't got the wrong Terry Edwards. I knew that he
wanted the country and western.
He was actually going for me. It's one of those kind of nice things where somebody sees something in you that you don't see in yourself. He'd known of me playing with Gallon Drunk, and he'd seen me playing in Gallon Drunk in Cork when he lived down, you know, a younger man and a young fan down there. So he knew what I did, and he knew that some of the bigger shows that I did, like the Revisitors, things like Swordfish Trombones Revisited, the music of David Lynch Revisited, with a pretty high-notch band of, you know, a core band plus me, in it with various solos. So he knew that I did that. He knew that I played with Nick Cave and wasn't uncomfortable playing the bigger shows and those sorts of things. He asked me to do this, and we had a chat like we're doing on Zoom now, and talking about all these things. And I said, can I just get back to you in a couple of days about this and have a think about it? Because I'm from Essex. I don't have any Irish blood in me, as far as I know, and I've not done any traditional Irish music or that sort of thing. So I was wondering, why was I put up for them? And I thought there might be somebody better placed to do this. And I thought this is a really good opportunity to do something great. So I asked him, why did you light upon me? And he said, when Nick Cave walked into the rehearsal room, I wanted him to feel comfortable, like he was in safe hands. And I realized that actually the style of music wasn't the important thing. It was putting the right headmaster in charge of the school, you know. So he just knew that I could get the best out of the musicians, was diplomatic with the soloist, could cover a lot of bases, because I do work in a lot of different genres of music. That was something that I didn't realize in myself. And funny enough, having worked with a guy called Bent Clausen, who's a Danish musician, he was the musical director for a couple of the Tom Waits theatre pieces, Alice and Blood Money, and then The Black Rider, which I was in the band for. And he was telling me about, he auditioned to be in a band or in the band for one of these things. And he got called back on it. And Waits thought that he obviously is a good musician and could do the percussion work, tune percussion, which is what he thought he was up for. But he thought that he would actually be able to pull the musicians together. I kind of thought that's what it is. Somebody sees something in you that you don't know in yourself.
Yeah, I love that.
And Gary's got me to do one or two things since then as well. So I guess I must do something right.
Well, look, it's a pretty impressive list for the birthday party, the celebrations, but it's also, if you're the headmaster, these are not a bad list of pupils, really, let's be honest. So you mentioned Nick Cave, Imelda May, Bono, Sinead O'Connor, Johnny Depp, Sharon Shannon. I mean, my God, this is incredible.
Yeah, so it was quite a good name drop of a list, isn't it?
Amazing. Now, let's also talk, you mentioned Madness, and then there are people like him, Billy Bragg, I mentioned earlier on, and you've worked with Billy on a few albums, Julian Cope, Nick Cave we've mentioned. And there are people like that who, it seems to me, like yourself, like music is obviously just in the blood. And whilst they might do different things, I know Suggs is doing like a stage show and stuff like that, they always steer back to it. They can't kind of avoid it. And there's this kind of, a bit like Paul, there's this longevity, this kind of desire to keep performing, keep creating new music, and they're all creating new music all the time. What have they got in common that kind of drives them forward? And you know, what do you see as the similarities between a Suggs and a Nick Cave and a Weller and a Tom Waits?
I think it is that desire to find something new to keep. I think the enjoyment of music is the one thing. I mean, you don't, there comes to a point where all the people you're talking about are comfortably off financially, I would say, to a greater or lesser degree. So it's clearly not for the money. And I think because all these people have been on the front cover of enough magazines and probably can't go on the tube if they wanted to and all that sort of thing. So it's clearly not for the fame either, or the ego, I don't think. Artists of a certain caliber. There's absolutely no reason in the world financially why Paul McCartney should ever write another song, but I don't think he can stop, because he observes things and he wants to, it just makes you want to do it. And I can't, like you said, how did you start off playing music and what did you do? And in a sense, I don't really know, but I know that I don't do anything else and I don't want to do anything else. And it must be the sheer enjoyment of it, despite all the other things you can complain about. Straight after COVID, a trumpet player mate of mine, Nick Etwell, said he'd got his first couple of gigs. He said, and there's a thing where we've got to play loads of Motown stuff and loads of Stax things. And there's a trumpet player, it's all high stuff. He said, it just feels like you're being punched in the mouth for 2 hours. All this stuff. He said, anyway, how'd you get a musician to complain? Give him a gig. So for all the stories you hear about, oh dear God, and then I had to do this, I had 2 hours sleep and had to get a plane to go and do this, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, it's actually because you like playing the music. You would do it anyway. And also it reminds me, there was a great interview with David Bailey, the photographer, well into his 60s, knocking on the door of 70, I think, when this was being done. He was going out with his cameras and they were saying, why do you do this? He's got all of the Twiggies and the Michael Caines and all those from the 60s and onwards. And, he wouldn't need it for the money. And he said, why'd you go out with your camera? And he said, well, I might just find something. And I just think that's what we all do. We're just looking for that something that we haven't done before with our 12 notes, with our Hasselblad camera or whatever we're using. You might just find that thing you've been looking for the last 40 years. And you might have found it many times in many places, but you might find it in that other place you hadn't expected to. Nice. And I think that's why we do it, and I think that's why they do it.
There's a honorary councillor, so the Style Council have these, so I guess, people who join the band, session musicians and go on tour and stuff. Steve Sedelnik joined us on the podcast, who talks about I asked him about an artist that I really love as well, David Gray. He talks about those early albums that he was part of as well. And you were the string arranger on Babylon, was that right?
It's true. That is true.
That's incredible. I mean, what a song! My God.
I know. I was in the van with Gallon Drunk going somewhere around Europe, and the bass player was also ran a recording studio, so I had a copy of Sound on Sound magazine, and there was a breakdown of recording that track in there. And there was saying, Terry, did you do the strings on Babylon? He didn't know, but why should he? But it was, So it's one of those things that, yes, I do. And I remember hearing it on the radio all the time.
God, I mean, obviously, I was doing breakfast shows at that time, and we'd play that every morning. I mean, it was massive. It was in the charts forever, it seemed.
And that version of it wasn't on the album. It was just done as a single.
You mentioned Madness. The Suggs, obviously, and Paul Weller had a single out in summer together. Obviously, they're really good mates. I don't know if you heard them interviewed on the Zoe Ball breakfast show together. It was absolutely hilarious. I think Paul had just come off the school run. Obviously, it's a breakfast show. Paul had just come off the school run. I think Suggs had just come in from the pub. It was wonderful. And he's an amazing character, but it must be a real honor, I guess, but also a real joy to play with that band because they put on an amazing show, but they have such an amazing set of songs.
Yes, they do. They're one of those bands that you go and see and hit after hit, and they're hits that you'd forgotten sometimes. Yeah. You know, they do rest some and bring in others every now and then, which is a great thing to do, which keeps everything fresh, keeps them interested, which therefore keeps the audience interested. It's great. It is great to play all those tunes with them. And the thing that I also like is that the band are very down-to-earth people. They'll always just have a chat. You know, I won't maybe see them, say, Mike Barson from one year to the next. And then when you do, he'll just have a quiet word with you aside from everything else and not part of the, excuse the word, madness. You know, they're a great bunch of people to be with on several levels. And I work a lot with Bedders. You know, he's in the Near Jazz Experience it's a 3-piece through us together. He was my best man at my wedding a couple of months ago. So. Oh,
nice. Oh, congratulations. But the thing is, they get you to do some bonkers things at times, though. Remind me of the Parkinson thing.
Tomo, Lee Thompson has gone off to live in Australia for 6 months. He'd just done a house swap with someone and just went off.
Oh, how lovely. What a fabulous idea. Nice.
And, they had to do something, so they got me in to be him. And Lee and Chris are approximately the same height, and I'm slightly taller. I'm not very tall. And he was just going, you're too tall. You should, and the Toulouse-Lautrec thing came up, that you should be like Toulouse-Lautrec. So there I was on my knees, and it was live. I was actually playing the saxophone down there.
Dressed as Toulouse-Lautrec on your knees.
On my knees. And Bedder said to me, if it's uncomfortable, you don't have to do this. Don't if you can't play kneeling down like that. No. But that was fine. The funny thing was that at the time, the BBC props department, they could get hold of costumes quite easily, which I don't think they can anymore because everything's been bloody siphoned off and privatised, Yeah. But they got they faxed through an image of what Toulouse-Lautrec wore, and they sourced a very similar costume. It's not a million miles from what he would have worn, So, and I had had a beard sort of glued to my face and everything, and I was having this makeup put on, and Michael Parkinson came into the makeup. And this is, I'm just this bloke from Essex. I'm not thinking this is the man I used to see every night in the 70s.
Yeah.
Every Saturday night, and I said, "Well, it's very nice to meet you. I hope it might have been under slightly different circumstances." And he just went, "I think it's brilliant."
Rhoda Dakar, you talked about, and Black Barn and being down there. She was great on the podcast, and these singles that she's doing, these covers in her style, her versioning of things like Every Day is Like Sunday on beautiful green 7-inch vinyl, for goodness sake, is a really nice project to be involved in. So are you officially part of her band?
I am the first cool sax player, or so she tells me. So yes, I've been playing with her for quite a few years, and obviously the stuff we did at Black Barn was pre-COVID, so we could all get in the studio together, and the covers album was actually done in lockdowns and things, so hence a slight change of the lyric in Every Day's Like Sunday.
I've not spotted that. What's
the town that they forgot to lock down instead of the town they forgot to close down?
Nice. I didn't spot that. Nice.
And so I did the horns at home in my little...
And you're like emailing them over, are you?
Yeah. And then Lenny is the producer and mixer on these things. He's great, Lenny Bignam. Just send the files over to him. But I was very pleased to sneak a little quote in at the end of that tune, which was from Free Nelson Mandela. It's slightly slower. The I put that little melody.
Nice.
Just over the play out, And
did you explain on the email that was what you'd done, or did you just send it over and see if she'd notice?
I just sent it over.
I mean, it's amazing that technology meant that people during that period, which was horrendous, and musicians like yourself couldn't gig, and earn a living doing what you love doing. But actually, you could create music together, and Paul creating the Fat Pop album in that same way with his band members.
Mm-hmm.
But the fact you can create these files in your bedroom and then email them over, and people are building it as collages on Adobe or Pro Tools. It's a remarkable thing, isn't it?
It's great. Also, I think it helped people get quite creative and things. So, for instance, we've nearly finished a new Near Jazz Experience album, but that's based largely on us being, the three of us being in separate places. But Simon, drummer, he programs events at a cinema in St Leonard's on Sea. He lives on the south coast. So, of course, they couldn't open the cinema. He just set his drum kit up in the front of it. He would go in every day, practice, record some of the drum patterns and things on his iPhone, send them to us. Mark might take one of them, there's lots of them. So we just created little bits and pieces. And when we could then go out and play, it was a great place to actually write and rehearse. We went down once every couple of weeks to the cinema, which still couldn't be open, but you could do work if you couldn't do it anywhere else. And we literally couldn't. And we were very well spaced out between the three of us. And we managed to write a new album, which we've just managed to almost put to bed as we speak. It's almost there.
Fabulous.
But there's another way of working, which we wouldn't have done if we hadn't had those restrictions.
In university, you find creativity and new ways of doing
absolutely.
things.
And really got us firing off, thinking different ways and coming out with some new music. So that's really refreshing.
And when will we get to hear that?
I think we should have that out April-ish.
Right. Oh, well, we'll keep an eye on that, and we'll share that when it comes around. Hey, look, man, this has been so lovely chatting with you. I've loved spending time in your company. I have two final questions for you before you go, okay?
I've got one for you, though. What's that gold disc over your shoulder that I can see on this?
Let me go and get this.
I knew there'd be a story behind it.
Just to make you laugh. So this here...
This is a very good bit for radio.
This here is a framed gold disc, all right? So you're wondering what I've performed on, aren't you? See? How many millions of copies I've sold. This was created by a friend of the podcast, Steve Wheatley, bless him, who, when Anne Weller was on, can you read that there?
Yes, I can, yeah.
Okay, so Anne Weller, episode 100, podcast centenary celebration, desperately seeking Paul Weller fan podcast, #1 Great Britain podcast charts. And that was Anne Weller, who was episode 100, Paul's mum. And he created like a gold disc. And there are only two of these in existence, one for me and one for Anne Weller.
How lovely.
And I gather it's on the stairs with all of Paul Weller's gold discs.
I'm glad I asked then.
Oh, I'm glad you did as well. I forgot that was there. Brilliant. Yeah, it's a blessing for doing that. But it was, really a nice surprise and a really funny story. But she was a fabulous guest. Loved that. Bless her. And lives in Ripley, so she lives just over the road from the studio as well. So
okay.
Nice connection. Good question, Terry. Right, two final questions for you before you go. You're allowed one Paul Weller song for the rest of your life. It can be The Jam, The Style Council, or solo. What are you going to go with?
You're the best thing that ever happened.
So you mentioned the Style Council with your band. You weren't kidding me, right? Why that one?
I'm terribly sentimental. It's a lovely song.
It's a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful song. Right. Now, the purpose of this podcast is to talk to lovely people like yourself who have had these either fleeting connections with Paul, played on a couple of songs, just big fans, whatever it is. I love hearing your stories, so thank you for joining me. But I've got to be honest, the purpose of the podcast is for me to get the interview with Paul Weller that I never managed during my radio career. So if it happens, I mean, you're lovely, but you're like a stepping stone to that interview with Paul, right? If it happens, what should I ask him?
Oh God, that's a blank sheet of paper, isn't it? It's not easy to edit a blank sheet of paper. I was going to be flippant and say, when are you going to get Terry Edwards on another album? So that's the flippant question. Actually, I think what would be a muso question, because he's, his voice and his lyrics and his songs are very much what you think of with Paul is, I would ask him who his favourite guitarists are, instrumentalists.
Oh, right, okay.
I think I would ask him a muso-type question like that.
I've never seen him ask that before either. You seem like favourite musician or favourite singer, and he talks about the Beatles and Small Faces and all that a lot.
Because as a guitarist, what I always the thing that I looked at often was one guitarist bands. So that interested me. I know you can do loads of stuff in the studio and everything, but Led Zeppelin, The Who, The Jam, bands that have one guitarist, you have to play lead and rhythm at the same time kind of thing. So I think he'd be quite interesting to find out who he likes on guitar.
That could go anywhere. Yeah, and it'd be a real surprise if he said Eric Clapton, right? Nice question. Hey, Terry, thank you so much for your time, man. I really appreciate it. Good luck with what's next. Share details of the album and that, and we'll make sure we share that on social media and stuff. Sure. But thanks so much for joining me.
My pleasure.
My thanks once again to Terry Edwards. What a lovely fella. Head to my website for the show notes to this podcast episode, including links to some of the songs that we talked about and plenty of Terry's music, including a Spotify playlist that I've put together as well. It's all there. PaulWellerFanPodcast.com. And whilst you're there, you can show your support for the podcast by heading to my store. We have exclusive merchandise, including our official podcast mug, and you can buy a virtual coffee as well. On the roll call for doing that this week, Phil Baker, who says Bill Wheeler's podcast was brilliant. Keep up the great work, Dan. Thank you, Philip. Hi to Mary G, says keep going strong. Brilliant guest, brilliant podcast. Thank you, Mary. Hi to Dean Parkinson, says, always enjoy your shows, Dan. Thank you. It will be great to get Mr. Craddock on at some stage and Marco Nelson if you can. Hey, fellas, if you're listening, get in touch. Yes, I'd love to have you on. Alex McLaughlin says, Happy New Year, Dan. Thank you, Alex, for your support as well. This one's from Ian Hamilton, says, thanks, Dan. These have given me a lot of enjoyment over the last couple of years. Has it really been that long? Wow. Hi to Mal, says, all the best from Newcastle, Dan. What a fantastic picture you and all the guests paint. It's a real gift and helps me escape from the rat race for just a little while. Thank you, Mal. Thanks to all of you for your support. Head to my website, grab a virtual coffee, and I'll give you a shout out next week. Don't forget, make sure you follow, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, Google, and more. You can find me on social media as well. Do spread the word. Get in touch on Twitter @WellerFanPod or on Instagram and Facebook. Just search for Paul Weller Fan Podcast. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time.